Hello there, thank you for clicking on my bait. You have entered the virtual factula, so let's talk about why making fight books work in actual fencing is so hard and what you can do to mitigate that problem somewhat. So I wanted to do this video a year ago already, so I made a script, filmed everything, and I didn't really end up liking it much. It just became too much of a rant, and in the end I gave up on editing and went on with my life. Recently though, a clubmate of mine who also follows this project asked whether it would be possible for me to do a video on how to interpret fight books, and I thought that was a marvelous idea, so that's how I decided to pick up on this topic again. Using fight books to learn fencing is a bit of a contentious topic within the community. There is the whole HEMA sportification debate, which is pretty much a perpetual discussion about what the goals and methodology of this whole historical fencing thing should be. Should it be, for instance, about the sources that describe fighting as it was done in the Middle Ages and early modern period? Or should it rather be about using historical-ish weapons and learn to fence as well as you possibly can with them? Proponents of one side are lamenting the sportification that seems to be going on within the hobby, while the other side is just memeing about how fight book nerds can't fence. Most recently, at least at the time of recording this video, the discussion flared up a little bit because a channel called HEMA Fight Breakdowns published a video stating that using fight books and taking them literally will not improve your fencing, and that you need to have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of fencing in order to get anything from these sources. Now, you can have a lot of valid criticisms of this video, but when it comes to the main point, I think he's absolutely right. I would like to add something to this point though. I personally really enjoy working with fight books. I think they add a lot of historical flavor to the whole fencing thing, and I also think that if you know what to look for, they can really help you solve certain problems that you encounter while fencing. At the same time, I'm also known within the community as someone who really makes that fight book stuff work even in a competitive context, so I felt it was kind of right to make a video about this topic. What I would then like to add is how I think you can make these fight books work for you. Now, depending on which camp in the whole sportification debate you find yourself in, you will either call this frog DNA or context. But to me, that difference really doesn't matter all that much. So if you're here just to learn how to fence with longsword and messer as well as you possibly can, then you can either reinvent the wheel for literally every problem in your fencing you'll ever encounter, or you can turn to books that were written by people for whom these fencing arts were very relevant. In which case you'll need to be able to add that frog DNA. Or, of course, take lessons from someone who already has. If you, like me, are interested in recreating some sort of a lost martial culture, you're still going to have to add this context and fundamentals to a fight book, otherwise none of the things in them will work for you and you will fail to achieve your stated goal. That is because, and I'll reiterate the point here, fight books are not fighting. They are rather an attempt to write down an embodied knowledge about fighting, which includes tactics and fundamentals, but also knowledge about the place that violence had within society. They were made for various reasons, ranging from trying to impress potential patrons to trying to write down some sort of class curriculum. But very few, if any, were ever intended to be complete lessons. So, fight books are not fighting and they're not objective reality. But if you're interested in the historical part of HEMA, I still think you need to learn how to fight well within that objective reality. Otherwise, you'll not really be able to embody the fighting knowledge described in those sources, because you kind of also need that embodied knowledge already to learn from them. The fundamentals might definitely be present in a fight book, but at first you might not have the tools necessary to recognize them as such. And you do kind of need these fundamentals to start actually learning and benefiting from a fight book. And this presents us with a bit of a conundrum. So yeah, taking a fight book and then taking everything that it says literally will probably make your fencing worse rather than better. And it also means that most people doing historical fencing might not necessarily benefit an awful lot from fight books, apart from it adding the historical flavor that we mentioned. But should we feel bad about that? I don't think so. Making a good interpretation of a fight book is really hard, and just reading one for fascination's sake is still totally valid. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend a class trying to figure out how Lekkerkner teaches you to put someone in a bag? Additionally, in most areas there's plenty of people to take lessons from. One of the things I wanted to achieve with this series is to actually describe for people what I think these fundamentals for Lekkerkner's Messer are. But if you're at the point where you feel you have the fundamentals down and want to start working with your own interpretations to actually improve your fencing, there's a few things you can do to improve your chances of getting it right. For a source that I'm very familiar with, which is Hans Lecuner's Fight Book for the Last Messer, I find that you need to get your interpretation of a technique right on at least 3 levels, being the mechanics, the tactical application, and the context of the technique. If you get any of these 3 wrong, you might very well end up with something that will completely fall apart in sparring. To demonstrate what I mean by this, we'll be looking at a technique that is often considered to be a little bit shitty, and I hope to show that if you get the interpretation right for this technique, you will be left with something that will definitely work really well in sparring and might even serve you well in competitive environments as well. Now, the technique we'll be looking at is called Ansetzen. It can be found on page 37 recto of the 1482 version of the manuscript, and the verse and text go something like this. You should set them on 4 ends for blood to be drawn, whether from above or below. The straight point connects just so. Here the master speaks about setting on. Setting on is a good and earnest piece, and it works well against the 4 positions. You should do it as soon as you want to end a fight with a knife, so perform setting on like this. Position yourself in the guard of the bastion. If they want to cut or thrust at you from their right side, come before and shoot the long point to the next opening on their right or left side. So this interpretation here is one of the variations of Ansetzen against an attack from your opponent's right, and it could look something like this, at least against the cut. However, people still struggle with it quite often, so what could be going wrong here? First off, it could of course be the mechanics, so the way you move. Thrusting into Langenort or long point sounds easy, but there's still quite a few potential errors one can make. Trying to make the thrust while also covering a line will probably mean you'll lack the reach that is long point's biggest advantage. Furthermore, trying to keep the knife blade in a straight line with your arm may sound nice in theory, but in practice this means your wrist structure might end up being broken, which could then mean you'll either disarm yourself or set yourself up for a very painful injury. There's really no description, furthermore, of what your feet should be doing, but since you need to thrust before your opponent starts their cut, I think it's safe to assume you need to come forward somehow, either by stepping or by lunging. A lot more problems can arise in the domain of tactics, or how you apply movement in opposition to a fencing partner. The key here is timing. Getting it wrong will just lead to loads of double hits, and let's be fair, no one likes doubles, which is what I think gives this particular piece such a bad rap. So does the text give you a clue about that? Thankfully it does, for Lecuner tells you to come before, or vor in German, signifying that the action described happens before the opponent performs their action. So if you try to counteract the opponent's cut at the same time, you're actually working indes, or instantly, and you obviously get a double. Long point doesn't have much of a defensive component after all. If you land your thrust before they start the attack, however, you don't need that defensive component, and you can simply afterwards follow up your thrust with a parry, just to be safe. But how can you start your thrust before they launch their attack from above? Well, the line "if they want to cut a thrust at you" might help a bit. You should only try to use Ansetzen if you can spot an attack if it's still in the preparation phase. In practice, I find this works great when my partner is in reach of my thrust and decides to switch of another position. If they don't attack, I land a thrust and I'm happy. If they do attack from that new position, my thrust will have landed before they can initiate the attack, I'll be able to parry the afterblow, and I'm still well content with the outcome. So what about context? Well, this simply means that techniques can be quite situational at times. Some techniques are just meant to be hyperbolic showpieces for playful public fencing events known as Fechtschule. Others have their place in both fencing practice and duels, and yet others are exclusively intended for self-defense. In this case, the text holds a few clues to the intended context. Earnest piece and to end a fight with a knife both point to this having been useful in an earnest and specifically antisocial fight. That means that the violence is expected to be very real and the harm done to an opponent will fall way outside of what is socially acceptable for 2 guys just fighting it out. Because presumably, your opponent might have attacked you in a very similar way. For this technique, I think that checks out quite neatly. It is a well-known fact that stabbing someone has a somewhat detrimental effect on their overall health. Historically, using the right technique in the right context was vital. In 15th and 16th century German cities, people could be quite understanding if you stabbed someone during a fight in the street, as long as you could prove that your attackers left you no other option to end the fight like that. Or if your family was well connected, of course. Stabbing someone to death at the Fechtschule? Well, I hear that joining a band of Landsknechte to relieve the siege of Vienna is pretty nice this time of year. Thankfully, nowadays we have fencing jackets, masks and flexible training weapons. We can stab our fencing partners and still be friends afterwards. So none of the above has to be a consideration for us right now. But given that the technique originated in an earnest context, it does tell you a little bit about what kind of movement to expect from your partner. If someone's aim is to really maim or kill you, they're going to be cutting differently than when they simply try and touch you on the jacket or mask. That means that if someone uses the messer as if it were a sports saber, or just tries to give you a light touch, Ansetzen will be all but useless. The time you have to come with your thrust before the attack starts is just too short. Thankfully, you can do other things in that case. Ansetzen has a place within modern HEMA sparring and competition, but you need to recognize that place and not try to shoehorn it into situations it was never intended for and won't work in. So see when your opponent makes bigger movements or just goes from position to position. In those cases, Ansetzen is great. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Fight books are not actual fighting, they're not reality, and if you work with them, you need to take that into account. There's an awful lot that can go wrong when you try to interpret them, but if your interpretation takes into account the mechanics, the tactical side of things, and of course the context of a technique, you'll probably find something that will actually work. If it all clicks, fight books can be great resources, both for improving your understanding of fencing and your understanding of the past societies that fencing was actually practiced in.